At 24 years old, I found out both of my fallopian tubes were blocked. I wanted to have a baby, and suddenly I was basically being told, if you want to get pregnant, IVF is your only option. And there was one pretty big problem with that. I couldn't afford IVF. This was around 2004, and we were talking about something like $10,000 to $15,000 out of pocket. My insurance wasn't covering it. I simply didn't have that kind of money. So I remember thinking, okay, now what am I supposed to do? Because here's where my brain immediately went. I understood that IVF could potentially help someone get pregnant despite blocked tubes. But I wanted to know, what about the tubes themselves? Why are they blocked? Can anything be done about that? Can they ever open again? And if you've been watching my stories lately, you probably already know where this is going. Because apparently I've been doing this since I was a little girl. I started asking why. Why is this happening? Why is IVF being presented as my only path forward? And most importantly, is there another option nobody has told me about yet? So I went home and did what Jodi does. I went down a rabbit hole. But you have to understand, this was 2004. This was old school internet. There was no TikTok, no Instagram, no ChatGPT. There weren't women online making videos saying, girl, here's what I did for my block tubes. That world didn't exist. I would sit at that computer searching things like, how do I unblock fallopian tubes naturally? And there was almost nothing. But I wouldn't leave it alone. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. Books, herbs, homeopathic approaches, natural health, scar tissue, adhesions, anything that might give me another piece of the puzzle. One clue would lead me to another, and another. And eventually I came across something I had never heard of before, serapeptase. And that's where someone very important enters my story, Robert Redfern. Robert was one of the major pioneers who helped introduce and popularize serapeptase in the West. He's passed away now, so I especially want to put some respect on his name when I tell this story. Because I actually reached out to Robert, and I asked him, have you ever heard of anybody using serapeptase for blocked fallopian tubes? And he told me, no, he hadn't. But he didn't stop there. He essentially said he didn't see why it couldn't potentially help or why I couldn't try it. And that mattered to me because I was asking about something that wasn't an established use. There wasn't some protocol he could hand me. There wasn't a success story he could point me toward and say, here's another woman who already did it. He didn't know. I didn't know. But instead of dismissing the question, he was willing to entertain the possibility with me. And sometimes that's all somebody like me needs. You mean there's a possibility? Okay, I'm going to keep digging. And I did. Serapeptase became one piece of a much larger journey. I kept researching. I eventually started learning about different herbs and traditional approaches. I experimented. I learned. I changed things. I kept asking questions. And this wasn't some little 6-month project, okay? This went on for years. And I had absolutely no idea at 24 where any of this was going. I didn't know it would eventually influence what I studied. I didn't know I'd go on to formally study natural health. I didn't know I'd eventually have thousands of women gathered in an online community talking about blocked tubes. I didn't know I'd write a book. And I certainly didn't know that all of those little pieces I was collecting would eventually become something called the fallopian tube formula. None of that existed yet. There was no FTF. There was no course. There was no product. There wasn't even Dr. Jodi yet. There was just Jodi, 24 years old, sitting in front of an old school computer with blocked fallopian tubes and not enough money for the only option she'd been given, thinking, there has got to be something else. And looking back now, I think there's something really powerful about that. I didn't have the answer. I didn't even know where I was going to find the answer. I just believed enough to keep looking. And I've learned that sometimes that's where everything starts. You don't necessarily have to see the entire road in front of you. Sometimes you just have to leave enough room in your mind to say, maybe there's another possibility. Because once you truly believe something might be possible, you start noticing things you would have overlooked before. One little piece appears, then another. Then somebody says something that sends you in another direction. You find a book. You discover a person. You learn something you didn't know you needed to learn. And slowly, the pieces start fitting together. And for me, I believe God is in that. I believe when you're sincerely seeking, praying, learning, asking questions, and staying open, God can lead you to answers you couldn't see when you started. That's exactly what happened to me. At 24, I didn't know what the answer was. I just couldn't shake this feeling. There's got to be something else. And thank God I believed that enough to keep looking.